We want to welcome you out to the second in a series of history lectures sponsored by the Layton Heritage Museum. My name is Donita Gatherum, and I'm the chairman of the Heritage Museum Board. And we won't introduce the board members, but there are quite a few of them here tonight. And we appreciate the support that you're giving this lecture series, and we hope that you tell other people about it so that we fill the room each month. Today's lecture is going to be given by Stephen Handy, and this is a little biographical sketch about him. You probably recognize his name. He's been in the Layton area for 40 years, 8 years on the Layton City Council, and 10 years in the state legislature. He was born in Ogden, graduated from the U of U with a degree in English and human resources. His career has been in advertising and marketing, and he is the author of a book about Lagoon, a very attractive book on Lagoon, and also one on the First National Bank and one on housing at the Hill Air Force Base. His wife is Holly, who is in the district office for the Davis School District, and he has 6 children and 16 grandchildren. The topic is the Iron Horse, Iron Rails, the railroad as it came through Davis County. I'm indebted to the railroad that came through Davis County. If it hadn't been that the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad came through Davis County, I wouldn't be here. That's another story, though. It's not Steve Handy's story, that's my story. And we'll thank him in advance, and then after the meeting after his speech is over, we'll just dismiss you to go home. Thank you for your attendance. Make sure you advertise this. If you haven't been over to the museum to see the exhibit featuring the century of Layton in pictures and text, you'll be in for a real treat if you get over there. So thank you again, and we want to thank Steve Handy in advance for his presentation tonight.
Thanks very much, Donita. They have told me that the overhead system isn't working, so I'm going to try to project. But people have said I have a big mouth, so we'll try to make that work for you. Now, if anyone sitting in the back does one of these, I'll speak a little louder, okay, so that you can hear me. I don't pretend at all to be an expert on this subject. And the research that you're going to see here in this, there are 42 slides that we're going to look at tonight. You say, oh no, that's too many. No, it's not too many. It's just so interesting. But Bill Sanders and Harris Adams have put this together, and we owe a debt of gratitude to our local, incredible historians with this unbelievable historical this depth of interest and history of our community. And, you know, even though Donita said that Holly and I have lived here 40 years, 41 this spring, we're kind of newcomers to a lot of you here, but we came to Layton and we put down deep roots and love the community entirely. Now, Donita referenced some of the things that I have learned about the area that Bill, I think, and Harris said, well, Steve, you can come and talk about this, but this is the depth of my knowledge. But let me show you a couple of things here. So when I had the opportunity I was the director of marketing at the Deseret News for a lot of years, and when I was at the Deseret News, we did a lot of books. The paper was 150 years old. We did a book. We sent reporters and editors when they did the sesquicentennial so this was 1997, crossing the date from 1847, and we took all that content and went and did a book. The first year that the Jazz went to the playoffs and played the Bulls, 98 or so, we took our content and we did a book. So I really learned how to do kind of the book business. I wasn't writing the books, but I was the person responsible for gathering up the information and then marketing it. And so I left the paper and came to work for 1 year for First National Bank. And while I was transitioning out of the bank and wanted to start my own business, the bank officers and the owners came to me and they said, Steve, we know how to do books, and the bank is coming 100 years old. And would you consider doing a book on the history of the bank? And I said, well, I jumped at it, but I said, you're going to have to help me through it. So I'm not a trained historian, but I figured out I do have the ability as a writer to kind of organize things and see things and put them together. So it was really Ralph and Harris and Catherine to some extent who helped me through, members of the board, who helped me through this. And we took about a year or so to produce this book, A Century of Putting People First, that came out in 2005. The bank started in 1905, and so 100 years later this came out. So when I did the history of the bank, it's really a history of Layton as well. And so I learned about the city, and Harris, really our historian of the city. He was able to help me through this, and he'd tell me, we outlined the chapters, and then I was able to write it and pull it together and then have it designed and published, and it's been a great success. So there are some things in here that I had learned about the railroad in Layton that I'll reference in a little bit. And then I had the opportunity, I've done several books, and Donita mentioned just a couple, but the one I did for the owners of Lagoon, I'm going to take the posted off note here, because when the Beach Boys came out to the amphitheater, I had them sign this one. So this one's a collector's item. But anyway, I got to do this book, The History of Lagoon. Lagoon, America's largest family-owned amusement park. And the history of Lagoon in the early days, of course, was the history of the Bamberger, and its roots, the roots of Lagoon really went to the Lake Park Resort that was part of was a DR&G also resort. And so I learned about that. So from that little basis of knowledge, I'll try not to disappoint tonight and share with you a couple of other things that I learned in my research. But what we're going to do is go through these slides, and we can make this interactive. And if you have a memory that you want to share, just raise your hand, and we can sort of have this interactive. This doesn't need to be, Steve lecturing and talking at you. Let's have a lot of fun tonight with this. So this is entitled The Iron Rails, Davis County's Connection to the World. And let's just figure out if you can see that well enough, or if we want to dim the lights. That was the question, if we want to dim the lights a little bit. I don't know how to do that. And I want to recognize Mayor Petro here, several members of the City Council. Don is here, Tom is here, Dave is here. Those are the ones here from the City Council. So let's get this correct so that you can see it and that I can see, okay? Is that better? Do you want these lights off? Or Jay from Parks and Recreation is our technical support, and he's going to get this so that you can see it the best way. Now that's better, isn't it? Yep. And I can see my notes, and you can see it. Okay, is that okay? Even on the back row, you're nodding yes. Terrific. So of course, this is the famous champagne shot at Promontory, and I had this amazing experience this last year. It was the 150th anniversary of this, and I had the opportunity, along with 30,000 or so of my closest friends. We went out there on May 10th, 2019, and that was I'd been out to Promontory a handful of times in my life, but it was really a special experience. I wasn't expecting about how great it was. And gosh, you had the Irish ambassador there. You had Elaine Chao, the Secretary of Transportation, who Chinese roots. You had of course all of the Utah dignitary types, and they had all these reenacting things. And were any of you there out there on May 10th, 2019? Some of you were. It was really, really fun, wasn't it? It was really something to have a good time. This is just aside. So we had gotten on a bus there at the bird refuge up here in Box Elder, and I was sitting on the bus, and there were some people there. Oh, how are you? This was the Dodge family from Omaha. Well, their ancestor, Grenville Dodge, had been the chief engineer of the Union Pacific, and they were there to reenact. Now, Grenville Dodge didn't have any male heirs, so this family was from his brother, and they gave me their business cards, It's the same company from back in the 1800s. It's a land company and a surveying company and a real estate company. Wow! And one of the great things they had in the capital, in the state capitol, was that he had this. Grenville Dodge had this a Winchester that they had in his museum there in Omaha in his house, and they had lent that to the celebration, and that was there in the Capitol along with the proclamation from Abraham Lincoln. It was really spectacular to see, but just delightful people. So we know this history, and of course we know the history. You should know the history about how they thought maybe that Corinne was going to be the Junction City, but that wasn't going to work, and so Ogden became Junction City. And I was born and raised in Ogden, and I knew a lot about the railroads. Harris knew my dad, who was a Weber County attorney, and my father told us that he had gotten the job for the Southern Pacific, and he was a fireman for the Southern Pacific for just one brief. He was a young man. Carol knew my dad, and and he said, "I thought if I could go to work for the railroad, I had it made for life." And that's what it was in those days. But as we know, there had been a major disruption of the railroad industry. But Ogden became a major railroad hub, and as kids, and the railroads were still running when I was a teenager. But as kids, we were forbidden to go on 25th Street. We couldn't. We did anyway, but we were forbidden to go down on 25th Street. So I think some of that great history. So. This is a terrific slide that I had never seen before that Bill and Harris provided to us. It's the Kaysville Brass Band, established in 1864, serenaded workers of the first train to enter the Salt Lake Valley. Played as the train moved from Morgan to Uinta. 14 band members: Joseph Barton, the captain, and the director. That's a wonderful photo. Where'd you find that? Was that in the Utah Historical Society or?
No, that's always been in the Kaysville Archive.
It been in the Kaysville Archives. That is a wonderful old photo, isn't it? Who knew that there was a band that they were doing that? It's just terrific. Then you have the pioneer involvement in the railroad building. So the Union Pacific bed was grading done by the church board contract workers. In those days, if you read Nothing Like It in the World. That was one of the great books on the Transcontinental Railroad, Nothing Like It in the World, Ambrose's book. You read that whole thing about Brigham Young and the Mormon graders and how they were totally ripped off by the Union Pacific. But what they did was so the UP owed the church $1.4 million for this grading work. They couldn't pay, or they wouldn't pay. And so he took the rails and tools and rolling stock as payment. So we call that in the industry today a trade out. That was a trade out. But they knew immediately, okay, so, and there was that lobbying that had gone on to bring the railroad into Salt Lake, and that didn't work out, of course. And if you read that history, how they finally had to have Congress intervene because the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, hello Bob, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific were crossing each other out there because they were getting paid in these sections, and they wanted to get as much as they. But that story of building the railroad, there is as much corruption in that as you will ever see in this country. But they did get the railroad built, and it really was a marvel. And it then began, of course, the development here that we're going to continue to talk about, aren't we? The development here that we're going to continue to talk about. And early Ogden Railroad Yard, that's a great photo. So the Utah Central Railroad, now when I was doing the Lagoon book, I read about this, and it talked about that they knew that of course, that they were going to have the Golden Spike finishing, and nobody knew what that was, but it was finally set on May 10th. But early on, they knew that there was going to be an opportunity to build the railroad line into Salt Lake from points north. And so they organized the company there on March 8th, the capital stock, 1.5 billion. It was 40 miles from Ogden to Salt Lake. And the directors were Brigham Young, William Jennings, Theramaz Little, Daniel Wells, those are some familiar names, and Christopher Layton. Now, one of the other names that I had learned in my lagoon research was Brigham Young's son, John. He was also involved with his father in building the Utah Central Railroad. But how about that? Our own Christopher Layton was one of those early directors. And so they broke ground in Ogden on May 17th. So that was 7 days past the Golden Spike and driving. And they reached Kaysville and Farmington November of 1869. Salt Lake City in January 1870. And the first passenger service started January 12th, 1870. Joseph Barton was the Kaysville route surveyor. So really, really interesting things. Let me see here what this next slide is here, because I wanted to talk about something. Well, let's just talk about that. So the Utah Central Railroad in 1870 was the first train that moved through Davis County, 31-ton locomotive built in Boston for $14,000. That's not much money today. I mean, it's a lot of money, but that had to be a lot of money to have done that. It was a 2-salon passenger car, a freight car, earning $25,675. Salt Lake to Ogden, one-way fare was $2. Excursion trains were organized to take the Utah Central. Now, what was very interesting that I learned in doing the book on Lagoon was they had been trying for a long time to access the Great Salt Lake and to kind of, I'm going to say, exploit the Great Salt Lake. How can we exploit this incredible natural wonder that no one really understands what it is, but there's got to be a way to make money, right? And so they started these, as the railroad got that going that way. Okay, this is going to bring access. The largest population base was in Salt Lake City. The next largest population base was in Ogden. It's going to get people moving back and forth, and it's going to give them access to the lake. And so these lake resorts started popping up. The first one was Lakeside in 1870 near Farmington. Then there was Lakeshore, northwest of Centerville. Then there was 1886, the Lake Park Bathing Resort. And there's a lot of pictures that we were able to get in the Lagoon book about Lakeside. And of course, Lakeside, there's the great, you can't see that, but you can come up afterwards and see it. The Cletting Pavilion, it was called. And Cletting was also the architect of the Utah Capitol and also Saltaire. So he's a famous Utah architect. And part of the, if you remember, I remember, and some of you, they moved the Cletting Pavilion to the current site of Lagoon, and it was there for a long, long time as the dancing pavilion. One of the other things that was really interesting was that on this page, you can't see it right here. There's a page coming up, but boy, this was a big, really interesting resort. Let me read this to you. The Salt Lake Tribune carried a notice on June 26, 1886, advertising 4th of July special prices, the DR&G Western Bathing Resorts. Now, we're only talking about the Utah Central now, so I'm sort of jumping ahead, but everyone wanted to get into the act, right, and build a railroad line. The Lake Park Resort Company, 1/2 rate for Salt Lake to Ogden, July 4th at $1.75. Good the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. The limit is 200 miles. One side of the pavilion was a 30 by 60 foot family restaurant. On the pavilion's other side was a 30 by 60 foot bar, quote, over which strict watch will be kept to exclude all objectionable characters, unquote.
Wouldn't make it there, huh?
Yeah, there you go. That's right, Paul. And then it said, then here, there's a wonderful old image, a postcard that we found that shows the railroad coming in here and the spurs coming out into Lake Park. An extensive article again, June 26, 1886. Left reads with a vision for the new resort that was to have its official grand opening on July 15th. It would include shade trees, a groomed lawn and a hotel. A spur line would carry passengers from the main railroad tracks of the resort. Regarding the actual beach, the story said, quote, the beach is a beautiful one, selected after careful examination of the entire lake shore within reaching distance. Now, those of us know there aren't any great beaches at the Great Salt Lake, but that's what they were promoting. just to skip ahead here a little bit, what they figured out was that the better resort areas were down on the south end of the lake, and of course then you had in 1887 was Lake Shore, which was up here west of Syracuse, and then there was 1871 Lake Point. These were the Southern Shore resorts. Black Rock Beach, Garfield Beach, Buffalo Park, Saltaire 1. Then 1933 Black Rock Beach 2. 1934 Sunset Beach 26, Saltaire 2, and 1982 Saltaire 3. So they kept trying to make something out of it, but that darn lake kept receding, doesn't it? You can't trust it. You just can't trust that darn lake. But the railroads was very, it was the thing that began to move people back and forth and provided that access to these larger populations. Here's a picture of the UCRR Salt Lake Roundhouse in 1880. That's a delightful photo, isn't it? The Utah Central Salt Lake City Depot, North Temple and 400 West. 1872 is what that says. And then this is, in 1871, extended to Provo. It was incorporated as the Utah Southern, extended to Brigham City, Logan, Idaho, incorporated. The Utah Northern, looking to take advantage of agricultural riches of Utah's towns, and greatly expanded freight services, as you know. Let's see here, going on. Look at that great photo of a wooden bridge over the Jordan River, a trestle, and the passengers boarding there in Farmington. In 1878, the Union Pacific gained control of the Utah Central Railroad, operated under the Union Pacific control for 9 years after that, right, Bill?
Right.
Yeah. So that's what happened there. Let me see if I can catch up to the handouts that Bill and Harris provided me. So now we're going to talk about the Oregon Short Line, the OSL. So in 1881, it was organized as a subsidiary of the Union Pacific. Granger, Wyoming to Portland, Oregon, the shortest route to the northwest, was how they promoted it. And in 1889, it merged with the Utah Central and 6 other smaller lines controlled by the Union Pacific. It was an ideal movement of people and goods through Ogden to Idaho, Oregon, and the Northwest. Look at that terrific map and that graphic that they found. It says 1904 on that graphic. That is really great. Here in Layton, the Utah Central and the Short Line was through Layton, and the tracks parallel the primary wagon road that we call Main Street today. And I have a photo that was from the First National Bank book. Let me see if I can find this. This was kind of fun. This was a photo that I didn't see in the. There's a couple of photos that Bill and Harris didn't put it in the thing, and you can come see this afterward. But here's some guys standing at the Oregon Short Line, and then here's I thought this was really interesting. So here's a picture of the depot, and there it is right there. And this is a close-up of it, and here's a caption that we found that we wrote for this. It says, Layton's Railroad Depot, circa 1905, this was a book about the history of the bank, and so that's the year the bank was organized, stood just north of Gentile Street in the middle of today's Main Street. And so I've had fun explaining to people, not that I'm, the Layton historian that these two gentlemen are, but, a lot of you who know this better than I do, who saw this personally. I never saw that. But why is Layton Street like that? Well, that's why, because the railroad ran down the middle of what we call the street today, didn't it, Harris? And so this is fun. It says, before the station was built, Kaysville residents, of course, this was out in the country, Layton was out in the country. Kaysville residents referred to the area that would soon become Layton as, quote, out on the railroad switch. Right, Harris? That's out on the railroad switch. The tracks ran through the center of town and were moved west in 1911, although a spur line tracks remained on Main Street until 1950. Some of you remember those tracks, don't you? That were not lots of head nodding here about those tracks that were there still in 1950. in 1950. So pretty fun history here. So this is the depot in 1880, the original Main Street depot. 1911, I just read about that, relocated the modern depot. Original depot moved off of Main Street and to relocated track location. And you can come up later and see those photos a little bit closer, or you can see this in the slide deck that they printed for me. Okay, Bill has something here.
If anybody in the audience knows the Alex family, Pete Alex's family, his dad was a section manager and had that little house next to where the water stream is there. They moved it off Main Street and made it into their section house. And that's where Pete Alex grew up.
Wow.
In that house, in that building.
Wow. Here's a funny story that I learned later on. So one of the other books I did is one of our famous residents. I was able to pull together Haven Barlow's life history for him when we had it published. And so one of the stories that he told me was when they built the Barlow Insurance down here, they couldn't figure out for a long why part of the building was falling apart on the other side, and they realized that they had built it on the railroad grade. And they had to get it shored up, why is the building cracking? And even they had forgotten, even with the Barlow Ellison history, they had forgotten that the railroad grade had gone down through there. So kind of interesting. So let's see. The next thing here is that we have the Kaysville Depot. The Kaysville Depot. And it was the first street, Maple Street, which is 100 South today, next to the Kaysville Milling Company. Do you remember that? Who remembers this? That being there. Let's see what page this is on. There's a whole chapter in the Lagoon book on Pioneer Village. Pioneer Village, of course, was opened in 1976 as it was a Centennial project, and they had worked on it for a couple of years. And so here's a photo of the Kaysville Depot that's now at Lagoon Pioneer Village. And here's the caption on it. It says, and I had done some research, and Harris helped me with this, pulling together the old newspaper stories. It said, this late 1880s Oregon Short Line, later Union Pacific Railroad Depot, was originally in Kaysville. The historic structure was acquired by Horace Sorensen and moved to his Pioneer Village. Do you remember where that was? That was down in Salt Lake, kind of going up Parley's Canyon down in there. And of course, then they sold that. I remember as a little primary kid, we went down to that Pioneer Village. And then, of course, they sold that to the Freed family, who moved everything to Lagoon. So that depot was picked up, and it says here, when it was relocated to Lagoon in late 1975, it caused a minor traffic jam as it was maneuvered through the streets of Salt Lake City. So they picked that up and put it on a flatbed and moved it up through the city and down through Salt Lake City and up and located it at Pioneer Village. What to add here?
The next slide shows you the movement.
And the next slide, okay, thank you. The next slide.
Oh, no.
No, that doesn't.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. So this is the Liberty Bell visit to Kaysville, the nation's birthday observance. I've read about the Liberty Bell, how it traveled around. At some place, traveled a couple times around the country, and so that's a really great photo that you've got there. The Oregon shoreline with the Kaysville Depot sign is there behind there. You can see it in the close-up of the photo. So pretty fun. So now we have the 1945, the 75th anniversary of the first Utah Central Railroad train to travel through Davis County. So this is the 75th anniversary, and this is 1945. And I wonder if when that photo was taken, if the war was over by then, or if the war was, who knows, winding down. Maybe it was still on when that photo was taken. This then is the this is the photo that Bill wanted to show. This is the depot on a flatbed. That, as you can see, because it's grainy, it was taken out of the Tribune of the Deseret News, and it shows it moving to Lagoons Pioneer Village in 1975, and they opened in 76. So that's pretty fun. Now what we have is in 1938, the OSL becomes the Union Pacific. I guess they merged and they were bought out.
Well, it was always a subsidiary.
It was always a subsidiary, and they just did away with the OSL name. And it was a great consolidation of railroad lanes. The Union Pacific served Davis County with a few changes. Destination services expanded. You can see the famous Union Pacific Shield logo graphic there. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Denver and Rio Grande, and I sort of jumped ahead with the how they and I'll talk a little bit more about this, how they had developed the Lake Park bathing resort. But in 1870 it was incorporated in Colorado. William J. Palmer, General Palmer, was the founder. It was a narrow gauge rail system, so it had a 3-foot rail span. So the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, what was their rail span?
4 foot 8.5 inches.
4 foot 8.5, Bill says, and this was a narrow gauge at 3. Have any of you ever been down there to Durango? That's a narrow gauge that still runs. The Silverton, or whatever they call it, something that, like there in Durango. It's yeah, that's right. So it expanded through Colorado's mining districts, moved to Utah's coal district in 1882, connected Salt Lake and Ogden to Denver, the shortest route through the Rockies. In 1882, trains became passenger and freight service to Davis County and the line west of the UCRR and OSL tracks. And so there were these parallel tracks running. Some of you remember that, these parallel tracks running. And the Salt Lake Depot 2 blocks south of the OSL terminal. This is a photo here of the Kaysville and Layton, Denver and Rio Grande Western. That was the other part of the name, depots. It was at Center Street, Sunset Drive, and Gentile and Sugar Streets. Who remembers that depot? Who can remember that depot? Here's a hand back here. Some of you can remember that depot. Who was the family there with standing in front of the car? Do you remember?
We don't know who they were, but he was the station manager.
The station manager, okay. The station manager.
In the 1940s.
In the 1940s. Isn't that just great? So here's some of the other things about some other photos of the Denver and Rio Grande, the Salt Lake depots, the waiting rooms, the ticket counter, and of course today the Denver and Rio Grande is where state history is located. The state archives is on the south end, and the state, we're working on something because the state cultural arts department, they're going to be moving out of there and trying to figure out what to do with the Rio Grande Depot. Rio Grande Cafe there, which is very nice. You know, if you that they've got great Mexican food. We'll give a little plug for that. But it's been a very tough area of Salt Lake City with a very, very tough homeless situation in that part of the city. Very tough stuff. Here's a neat photo. This is a train climbing up Spanish Fork to Soldier Summit on the way to Denver. That is a great photo. Look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 or 5 engines on there pulling. I'm sure that was coal. That was probably coal, wasn't it? It was a coal train that was going.
Steve?
Yeah.
When I went on my mission, I left Salt Lake on the Denver Rio Grande in a passenger train.
Okay.
But we had to have 2 engines to make this grade. And then it went over Tennessee Pass in Colorado and down the Royal Gorge.
Yeah.
And we had to have 2 engines on all that too, on a passenger train.
On a passenger train to go over there. Very interesting. Thank you, Harris. Did you hear him? All of you hear him pretty well? Hearing, Bob? You heard him? Good. Good deal. This next slide is that shows the black line center, the Utah Central. The red line was the Denver and Rio Grande. The blue line was the Bamberger. So you had a lot of these competing railroads. Of course, the Bamberger, I mean, the 2 other railroads, they were carrying freight. The Bamberger was, of course, initially a passenger railroad, and so it ran a different way. And of course, it was up at the east benches, the foothills. The iron rails, that's a great photo. Look at that. This was the contribution to Davis County agriculture, impossible to calculate, of primary importance. They were hauling all of the, of course, the sugar beet industry that was here, the other commodities that were grown here in Davis County and shipped, the tomatoes, the beans, all of those kinds of things, and the cattle, of course, that were moved by these railroads. And so it was as our historians are telling us, that it's impossible to calculate the economic impact. I mean, we know today with our sophisticated looking at things, we know that Hill Air Force Base is a $4 billion a year impact here in our economy. But there's no records that we could ever figure out what the economic impact was, but many of you know it was a very significant economic impact. The railroads moving goods and services and people in and out of our communities. This is the next photo. Of course, shows the packing of produce, and a display there, the Davis County grown fruit and vegetables markets throughout the United States. It was a big deal. And of course, in Ogden being a real railroad hub, that was a real important place for. They had lots of companies there where they were packing. My dad worked at, what was that? It was, can't remember now, but he worked downtown. You know, it was a canning factory. I think it might have been Utah Canning or something like that it was called. Maybe it was Del Monte, Paul. Del Monte had a big presence in Ogden for a long time. But maybe it was there. I've forgotten that for a second, what that was. So here's some more photos that will be familiar to you. The railroads moved products from the 4 flour mills, 5 canneries, 2 brickyards, and a major sugar mill, as well as other smaller product manufacturers. So, Woods Cross tomatoes. Look at those cans there that they figured out. The sugar, of course. So really great stuff. I mean, there's a lecture on every one of these things, and I think you have something coming up in your lecture series, don't you? That will take a deeper dive. So this is where I had jumped ahead a little bit, but the passenger service and destination resorts, the railroad was always interested in passenger service, a major part of revenue. In the 1880s and 90s, they started to develop destination services, and that's where they were trying to exploit. How do we get people out to the Great Salt Lake, and hopefully they like it and not get eaten alive by the brine flies. One funny story I think that I learned in the Lagoon book, that is, you know, they had the Lake Park Resort, and really it was just a few years. It opened in 1886. And the lake was receding, it was in that cycle, and they kept extending the pier. And Harris, I think it was you that told me that you were in an airplane and you saw that pier. Remember that story you told me?
No, I saw the racetrack.
The racetrack.
They had a mile-long racetrack, and flying over, you could still see.
Oh, and flying over, you could still see the racetrack. But they were trying to figure out all kinds of ways they were extending the pier, but we know, Utahns know, nobody wants to go out in that blue, gooey, awful Great Salt Lake and wade around, right? That's not really our idea of fun. So after a while, it was just a few years, Lake Park was abandoned. But very interesting is that one of the early investors in Lake Park was a guy named Simon Bamberger, who had made his money in mining. He was an immigrant from Germany. He was Jewish. He then was just such an entrepreneur that they opened Lagoon at its current location the same year as statehood, 1896, because they moved a lot of those structures. And I've read a couple of books about about that, moving those things with mule teams and horses and oxen, and moving them up out of there and putting them in the current site of Lagoon. And then he was smart enough to know that he had to start, I'm jumping ahead here, we'll get to it, he was building a railroad, the Bamberger, which became the Bamberger, out of Salt Lake to a destination, and he had to do it in stages. But then he became Utah's 4th governor and served as governor from 1917 to 1921, and then quite a remarkable man. So he was the governor during World War I, and there's quite some stories about that because he was a German, and that's another lecture that we'll give you another time. This is a photo of some of the double compartments. The Pullman cars were introduced. A notice to passengers, this train does not stop for meals. So you're on the train and you stay on the train. But there was some luxury travel with the DNRGW luxury travel. Some great photos there. You know the famous. Do we get to the dome liner yet, Bill? But something like that. But the California Zephyr, it's coming up. And if some of you have that experience, you're certainly welcome to share with us. Here we go. The California Zephyr. Yes, please. Here's Donita, a DRG story.
DNRG. My dad, and it was the Denver, Dirty, Ragged, and Greasy.
Dirty, Ragged, and Greasy. That was their nickname for it.
And my mother taught school. She just got out of Weaver State, and she and several other young girls taught school in Farmington. And at the same time they were teaching school in Farmington, there was a group that worked for the DNRG, and in those days, they worked out of Hooper Yards, which was in Salt Lake, but they had what they called outfit cars. Mm-hmm. And so your railroad workers lived in the outfit cars wherever they were parked, and they were parked in Farmington. Well, on the outfit cars were 2 or 3 young guys, and somehow one of the girls that was teaching at Farmington Elementary lined up a blind date with a couple of the guys that were working on the DNRG. And that ended up to be my mother and my father.
How about that? That's a great story, isn't it? Yeah, that's a great story.
My grandfather was foreman on the DNRG for 40 years.
Wow, so you have deep
Yeah, I can tell you lots of DNRG stories.
Dirty, Ragged, and Greasy.
Dirty, Ragged, and Greasy. And
Western.
Yeah, the W came later because the DNRG took out bankruptcy. And so they had to refinance, and then it became the DNRG Western.
Very interesting. Good history for us to understand. So then you're going to see this slide that some of you will have some ideas in, because it was the whole idea to boost railroad passenger service to a destination. And so that was the same thinking that they had done in the 1870 to try to use that rail line for destination for these tried and failed Great Salt Lake resorts. And that was the same theory that Simon Bamberger, as he brought his passenger rail line north to Ogden, but really it was to Lagoon, to bring people to Lagoon. And so here's all of these things, Sun Valley, Yellowstone, look at these terrific old posters that you found, huh?
The Royal Gorge.
The Royal Gorge.
Did I tell you a story about the Royal Gorge?
Tell us about the Royal Gorge.
Well, when I was on the train going to the mission field, they had the observation card on the back on the passenger train. And the railroad goes right along the river there.
Yeah.
And the porter, one of the porters on the car said, well, I trolled fishing along there. And he said, I get out on the back and put my line in the river and troll. We said, oh, we know that isn't true. He says, well, it is true. There's the railroad tracks and there's the river, and we're on the train.
Right. But it took me, I remember as a little kid going to Yellowstone, and you'd see, I wasn't paying too much attention, but before you'd go into the West Gate, remember there's the Union Pacific signage there, and I finally figured out they were running passengers, of course, to Yellowstone, and that was a way of building passenger business, wasn't it? So does anyone else have other experiences where you were taking trains to a resort or to a location
The railroads built the lodges.
And they built the lodges. That's the other thing. The railroads built the lodges. Yeah, that's the other thing to remember. So very interesting. This is a photo that they've shown us. So travel services, comfortable seats, luxury dining, observation cars, and first class depots and terminals. Also to access Utah's, canyon country, right? That you'd take the railroad as far as you could go, then you'd get on buses. They'd put you on buses, and there was a whole route there that's shown in that map up in there. Railroad built lodges, as Bill said, offered bus transportation from the nearest depot to parks. So now we have, we're going to talk about something maybe more familiar to some of you in memory. In 1890, incorporated by Simon Bamberger that I've referenced. He was called Beck's Hot Springs, which you recall where that is. You ever been on Beck Street? I go in for every day, twice a day. And so it was down in there. In 1892, the Salt Lake to Ogden Railway started. It was the second leg to Lagoon. In 1908, finished the line from Salt Lake to Ogden, both passenger service and freight. And then in 1912, they electrified and became known as the Bamberger. And there's some terrific photos here. And of course, here's some photos that Bill and Harris have found. Beck's Hot Spring up in the top there. And then here, the salt air out in the distance. And then here, of course, you have a scene at the toboggan ride and the other one at Lagoon. So the Bamberger, of course, ran through 6 Davis County communities. Commuters had early access to both Salt Lake and Ogden. Changed the demographics of northern Utah. How did the Bamberger change the demographics of northern Utah? How do you think that would have happened? You don't get to answer it.
Okay. I will.
Instead of hey Google, it's hey Sanders.
It's hey Bill.
Hey Bill.
It's hey Bill. Did any of you have any thoughts about that? Of course, it was the intermixing of, there was a lot of socializing going on, right? With going back and forth to my dad was from Ogden, even though he was going to the University of Utah, where he met my mother, who was a Salt Lake girl. But there was a lot of travel back and forth. How else did it change the demographics?
Well, you could live in Salt Lake and work in Ogden.
You could live in Salt Lake and work in
Or you
Ogden.
could work in Ogden or live in Ogden
Yeah.
and marry a girl from Salt Lake.
That's exactly what happened in my family, And of course, what memories do all of you have of the Bamberger? I know several of you must have memories of the Bamberger, of riding the Bamberger. Catherine.
Well, my parents rode it to, my mother went to Davis High School, and my dad went on to, what, it was Salt, I can't remember, it was Salt Lake.
Yeah.
And, so they didn't have buses, but they had the Bamberger to get back and forth. And then I used to ride it, to Salt Lake to take piano lessons.
To take piano lessons. And it was a big deal during the war, wasn't it? Because all of the defense plants were up here. My mom went to West High, and as a 17-year-old, she would come up here and work at the Ogden Arsenal. They were assembling ammunition during the war. These young girls were this was a good job for them. And so there was a lot of that, and there wasn't I-15 or even those previous 89 or 91. They were riding the Bamberger, weren't they? Were they also riding? Was there also passenger service on the other railroads?
Yes.
There was passenger service
But it
on,
wasn't as convenient as.
but it wasn't as convenient as the Bamberger, was it? It wasn't as convenient.
More expensive too.
And more expensive. Yeah, too. Bill's got some other terrific photos here.
Can I say one more
Yeah,
thing
sure.
about the Bamberger? The tracks weren't very straight. And when it got running pretty fast, it was just like this. So we didn't call it the Bamberger, we called it the Galloping Goose.
Yeah. That's pretty funny.
At night, the trolley would spark. The trolley had a little wheel up here that ran along the hot wire where the electricity was. And when it got going fast, that would bounce. And so there were sparks flying at night. Go by, you could see the sparks.
Yeah. Here's a couple things that I found for the Lagoon book. And here's you can see this afterwards, a map that we found from 1923 that shows the Bamberger, route. And then here is the bathing houses. Here's the train going by. This is an interesting thing, if you can see this afterwards, and some of you remember this. But they brought in the 1920s, they brought in like 50 carloads of sand from California to build this. Hawaii was a big deal, so they built this Waikiki beach theme there at Lagoon. And they brought in this white sand, and you can see a picture of it here, and the people would go bathe. Some of you remember this, I know, Carol, right? And you would go out to there, and this says, tracks of the Bamberger Electric ran on the lagoon's eastern side, because they used to call it the Lagoon, as you know, with the depot on the northeast corner. Trains ran every hour beginning at noon, according to a 1921 ad. Round-trip tickets were 35 cents. It cost 50 cents to park a car. So, which included admission, regardless of the number of passengers. More than 2,000 cars and approximately 30,000 people jammed the resort on July 4th, 1924. The lagoon's imported sandy beach bumping up against the train tracks provided a little Waikiki feel, even when with the constant interruption of the Bamberger. And this photo was from 1931. So, pretty fun stuff. Yeah, Bob.
How often did that Bamberger stop? Was it stopping at each community as it went along?
Yeah, somebody explain that, Bill and Harris. How often did it stop? So the stops were?
Actually, sometimes the motorman would he lived on a certain crossing, he'd stop for you, even though it wasn't a stop.
Yeah, so sometimes it stopped. But the stops were, there's that really neat monograph that they have a picture of. The stops were?
There were depots in every major city: Bountiful, Centennial, Farmington.
Bountiful, Centennial, Farmington, Kaysville, Layton, Clearfield.
And then, the Arsenal, they had
At the Arsenal, there was one here at the north, yeah.
And then it went from there into Ogden.
Then into Ogden, so there was a stop.
But any highway crossroads, they would stop for you to get off.
So Commissioner Stevenson said, where was the depot in Layton? Where was it? Can you remember where it was?
Right up on the corner of the Winco property.
On the corner of the Winco property over
Right
here.
across the street from where the White Chapel was.
Across from where the White Chapel, right here, was. Okay, that orients you Layton, Laytonites.
Wasatch and Gentile.
Say that?
South end of Wasatch.
South end, Wasatch is right here, south end of Wasatch and Gentile.
And then your 2 lanes of I-15 from the bridge over Gentile Street to 31st Street in Ogden are the road bed for the Bamberger train.
Yeah.
And it went to 31st and then up to Lincoln and then over to 24th Street.
31st to Lincoln to 24th Street, yeah. And I don't ever remember ever seeing it, but if you go in Farmington, if you go there, what's the east-west in Farmington there, the main that you come up from Station Park?
Lagoon Lane.
Well, not Lagoon Lane, but it's
No,
the,
it goes in front of the.
but you know where it is. But okay, let's put it this way. If you come off of the freeway and get off at Farmington, and you come north to the intersection, right across the street right on that corner was an old Bamberger depot that's been made into a home.
Yes, it is still.
Yeah. And I've talked to people that behind there and said, we still find rails and bolts and things all these years later. They're finding things in their backyard. They stopped looking for them. They're all over the place. But that was a depot.
Oh, there was a train in Cache Valley too. Was it called the Bamberger?
No, it wouldn't have been. The train in Cache Valley was what?
The Utah Northern.
The Utah Northern.
And it went clear to Preston, Idaho.
Okay, we cleared the press on
Was it like this train though?
Very similar.
Very similar. If you say. And Ogden Canyon, there was a train up Ogden Canyon. I don't know what that.
It
Bamberger
was a
also
street
built
car.
that.
Did Bamberger build that, but he didn't operate
He
it?
didn't operate.
There you go.
Because I heard it was a Bamberger.
Because that's what you heard. They built it, but didn't operate it. Yeah.
It was operated by the city actually for a while, Ogden City.
And it went to Huntsville back, and of course it stopped there at the Hermitage, another lodge resort, a destination to go to.
When I was small, some of the teenage boys found out if they let a little air out of their tires, they could get on the Bamberger track and drive on the Bamberger track on the trail. When Antelope Drive was still a gravel road, I was walking along it where the Davis Hospital is. And I could hear the Bamberger tooting clear up by the Clearfield station. And I saw a black Chevrolet car, a 1937 Chevrolet car on the Bamberger track. And there was nobody in the front seat. And there were two boys in the back seat. When they got close to the intersection, the Bamberger was about 100 yards behind them, just tooting, just shooting. I saw one of them jump over the seats, and he turned off of the Bamberger tracks and went east on what's Antelope Drive now. But I found out later it was Jay Harris. And it was, the other one was Howard Morgan.
And Howard Morgan. A couple of characters, your old friends and characters. A couple little things here, we're just about done. So, you know, we talked about the here's some photos of some of the depots, Salt Lake City, Kaysville, Farmington, some of the depots. 1952 disastrous rail yard fire forced closure. In 52, that was the last passenger run. They ran freight for a number of years, and then in car 127, the last train to run from Ogden to Salt Lake was 1959, I believe. No?
Well,
I don't know. And then 1970s, the depots were sold or demolished.
Haven Barlow rode that train from Ogden to Salt Lake, the very last train.
Yeah, he did. He was in the
They
state
had
senate at the time,
Heritage.
and he got on there. He told me about that. He rode the train, the last run, you know, the farewell run. They put some dignitaries on the train, and there the Bamberger, and there they went. So
Steve?
there you go.
They didn't show a picture of the school train because the high school kids from all through Davis County rode the Bamberger. They had a contract with the school district and to carry the passengers, the high school
How
kids
interesting.
from wherever to Davis High.
How interesting.
One train left from North Salt Lake to Kaysville, one left from Clearfield, Sunset to Kaysville, and then 3:30 they went back the other way.
Interesting. But this is the last slide, but how things change, that here we are, how long have we had the front runner now? About a dozen years it's been running, and now there's talk, I've heard some talk about double tracking the front runner. And we've got to get lots of reasons, we can talk about another time why we'd like to, we'd like to improve mass transit. But it's not as convenient, is it? But anyway, other things. That's the end of the slideshow. How fun has this been? Other memories or things that you want to share? You had fun tonight? Very fun, huh? All right. Anything? Ralph, are you going to say something?